Good morning, everybody. I am making this a short video as a follow-up to the last class we had. Recall that this course is a further development to ENG121, which was basically on word classes in the English language. And as a follow-up to the last class, I want to discuss briefly in the bid to revise what we had in the last class, which was the clause in the sentence structure of the English language. The first thing I would like to discuss is the constituents within the sentence. Recall that last semester we had the word classes, in which we have the noun, the verb, the adverb, the conjunction, preposition, determiner, etc. as various components of our words. All these come together to develop our sentence. Words or groups of words coming together will give you the phrase, and the phrase or groups will come together to give you the clause. A clause or more will give you the sentence. Last class, I introduced the clause to you, in which we discussed the types as the main clause and subordinate clause. Main clause we call the principal clause, the independent clause, that clause which can stand on its own and make a meaning. And it is also called the superordinate clause. All this you will find in your notes. The other type is the subordinate clause, which is dependent on the main clause. That is, the subordinate clause cannot stand on its own to make meaning. As an example, when I say, as I was coming to the class this morning, if I stop at that, it does not make a meaning until I have added a main clause, a principal clause, a superordinate clause, that which can stand on its own, and that is, I met an old friend. So that we will have, I met an old friend while I was coming to the class this morning, or while I was coming to the class this morning, I met an old friend. Types of a subordinate clause in the superordinates. I told you that we had the nominal clause, adjectival clause, adverbial clause. The nominal clause, which is also called the noun clause, is a clause that behaves in the ways that are characteristics of the noun, meaning that the functions that a noun or its equivalents may perform in the sentence structure, then the nominal clause can equally perform this. That is, wherever a noun can function in the sentence, wherever a pronoun can function, wherever a noun phrase can function, wherever the infinitive can function, wherever the gerund can function, then you can have the nominal clause. That is, you may have your nominal clause as the subject of the verb. You may have it as the object of the verb, as subject a complement, as object of adjective, as object of a preposition, etc. Then we spoke about adjectival clause, which is also called a relative clause. A relative clause, as you have been told, is so called because it is introduced by relative pronoun or relative adverb. Remember, I told you there are 5 relative pronouns in English and the 3 relative adverbs. The relative pronouns are who, whose, whom, which, and that. Whereas the relative adverbs are why, where, and when. What this means is that for us to realize the relative clause or adjectival clause, one of the 8 will have to introduce such a clause. So when I say the man who is to do the job has traveled, who is to do the job begins with who, which is a relative pronoun. Again, remember, there are 3 conditions that must be realized for us to realize the relative clause. 1, it must be introduced by a relative pronoun or relative adverb, as I have just told you. 2, the structure itself must have a finite verb, without which you cannot label it a clause. And 3, it must follow a noun or a pronoun. Whenever one of these is missing, then you have to re-examine that structure to ascertain whether indeed it's a relative clause or not. However, I told you we have relative clause in which a preposition may intrude, that is staying between the relative clause itself and its antecedent, which is a noun or a pronoun. And in such a situation, I told you, ignore it. So that when you have a structure like the name with which he is known and called is false, with which he is known and called, that with is intruding, it's in between the name and the clause. Just ignore it. That is what I told you. Then you have your structure in place. I told you we had restrictive relative clause, non-restrictive relative clause. Restrictive relative clause in which there is no break in the intonation contour, in which the clause is a necessary part of the sentence, in which we cannot remove it without affecting the grammatical structure of that sentence. Whereas in non-restrictive, as the name suggests, which means it is not restrictive, it is not limiting, it is not defining, it provides additional information, extra information. And usually, this non-restrictive relative clause is broken off the sentence with a period comma. That is, at the beginning, you have a comma. At the end of it, you have a comma. So that you can have smoking, comma, which is dangerous to health, comma, is popular among Nigerian youths. You can have smoking is popular among Nigerian youths. That is what we are saying. So take note. There must be 2 commas, that is, one at the beginning, one at the end, to pair it off so that it can be removed without affecting the grammatical structure of the sentence. Then the function of adjectival clause, the function of a relative clause, is to qualify its antecedent, which is the noun or a pronoun. Finally, we have the adverbial clause. I told you, one is the most mobile of all the elements in the sentence, meaning that it could come at the beginning, at the middle, at the end. But wherever you find it, it tells you the time, the place, the condition, the instrument, the means with which something is done. That is, an adverbial clause answers the questions where, when, why, how, etc. Or let us put it differently. It answers all questions except who or what. Take note, adverbial clause answers all questions except who or what. We mentioned about 6 types. Clause of time, clause of place, clause of manner, clause of condition, clause of concession. And that the function an adverbial performs in the sentence structure or in relation to the superordinate structure is that it modifies the verb in the main structure. For example, when you have Wole Soyinka wrote his greatest novel while he was studying in London. While he was studying in London modifies the verb wrote in the other structure. Or when you say, students are usually late for class whenever it rains. Whenever it rains modifies the verb are in the other structure. Or when you have, I sold the old car because it was too small for the use of the family. Because it was too small for the use of the family, modifies the verb sold. Be that as it may, what position in the sentence can be occupied by the subordinate clause. Traditionally, subordinate clauses are found at the end of the sentence so that you can have, I sold the old car. Then you have, because it was too small for the use of the family. You can have, students are usually late for class whenever it rains. You can have, I met an old friend while I was coming to the class this morning. That is one. However, for prominence, for emphasis, for focus, for theme, focus, theme, and emphasis, we may have the subordinate clause appearing at the beginning of the sentence, depending on what the speaker wishes to put in the front. And finally, a subordinate clause may be found at the middle, intra-sentence. Don't forget, a language is a dynamic, and for this very reason, you may have your subordinate clause intervening so that you can have part of the sentence at the beginning, part of the sentence at the end. For example, you can have something like, the woman has gone to report to the police. That is a clause, or that is a sentence. But you can have, the woman whose car was stolen has gone to report to the police. You can see it's coming in the middle. At times we call it intervening clause. Finally, before we round off this session, so that we don't make this too long, 2 questions quickly. 1. Can we start the sentence with a subordinate clause? The answer is yes. as I have explained. You can start your sentence with a subordinate clause. Though some scholars argue that it is literary, whether literary or whatever it is language use. Then 2, can we begin a sentence with a subordinating device? Yes. Can we start our sentence with but? Can we start it with although? In the past, scholars have frowned on this. But today, because of aesthetics, because language is dynamic, because we do not have legislation against use of language in terms of construction, then we may wish to say, but he will not come. But I know him more than that. And the man died. All this had been put in your notes, and I hope we will have a better time to interact and to answer your questions. Thank you.